Okay, so we are live right now, and let's give folks a minute to tune in to the live stream. I'm going to start letting people into the Zoom call and welcoming folks.
Great. Welcome, everybody.
Hello. How are y'all doing?
We got folks coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Jon Ossoff.
Nice.
Oh.
We got someone in the gear.
I see the t-shirt. All right. So we are live, and I'm just going to give people a minute or two to tune in. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to just keep everyone on mute for most of the conversation, and then when I open up to Q&A, I will unmute lines. I know that that's always a fun experience, unmuting everyone at once, but I don't want to assume people know how to raise the hand on Zoom. If you do,
the whole world's becoming Zoom experts in about 2 weeks.
Zoom pros. Yeah, I gotta say, I thought I was an expert on Zoom until all this started. Now it's all these new functions that we have to use.
Are you an early adopter?
I was an early adopter. I started using Zoom in 2018.
Wow, 18. Okay.
Yes, I had to get that. 2008. We weren't here with technology yet. All right.
Trying to toss out my man.
Okay, so I think we should go ahead and get started. I think more folks will join us on the live feed throughout the time that we are talking today. And so I just want to say welcome to everyone. And my name is Brionte McCorkle. I am the executive director at Georgia Conservation Voters. For those of you who aren't familiar with Georgia Conservation Voters, we work to advance policies for climate and environmental justice. We support elected officials who will make climate and environmental justice a priority, and we hold elected officials accountable to their actions and votes. And so I'm very excited to be here today with Jon talking about this important topic, as well as how it's related to coronavirus and public health. Climate change and coronavirus are two major challenges facing America and facing Georgians today. And so without a doubt, we are living through unprecedented times, and how we rise to the challenge before us will impact ourselves, our children, and generations to come. I think now more than ever, we need leaders who are committed to the bedrock environmental values of clean air and clean water and healthy and safe communities. We need leaders who are going to pass policies and make the investments that we need for a more just and sustainable future. It's important that our elected officials have clear positions on these issues, especially when they're on the campaign trail. We need to know where they are on protecting public health, on building a clean energy future, and supporting other actions to address climate change, which we will talk about today. And so I want to take a moment to welcome Jon Ossoff, candidate for U.S. Senate. And Jon, go ahead and say a few words about yourself before we dive in.
Thanks, Brionte. It's good to see you. I hope you're doing well. I hope everyone tuned in on Zoom and on Facebook is healthy. And I got to start by offering gratitude to everyone who's involved in the response to this pandemic. Of course, our healthcare workers, but also everyone doing essential work in logistics, critical infrastructure, food supply, and food production. There's a lot of folks working very, very hard right now who are underpaid, underprotected, undervalued, even in good times, and who still haven't gotten the support they need today, but are nevertheless persevering to make sure that the country runs as well as it can under these conditions. So gratitude and compassion to everybody who is involved in that effort, and to everyone who's doing their part by abiding by CDC guidelines and slowing the spread of the disease. So Brionte, we know each other. I'll take a moment to introduce myself to our guests. My name is Jon Ossoff. I'm a Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate in Georgia. I am a Georgian native. I run a media company called Insight TWI that produces investigative journalism, investigations of organized crime, political corruption, war crimes for international television broadcasters. And I'm running for the US Senate because I believe that political corruption in America has distorted our political system so badly that government policy is not serving the public interest. It serves the interests of folks who can purchase access to politicians. And we can do and deserve so much better than that. We have a whole range of issues where we need policy solutions. And one of my convictions is that the challenges that we face are not mysterious, and the solutions to those challenges are not mysterious. It's just a matter of political will. It's a matter of having a system where politicians are incentivized to serve the public rather than being incentivized to serve themselves or their political party or their political donors. And there is an astonishing level of corruption in our political system today. And it touches on healthcare, environmental issues, the dire state and need for investment in our infrastructure, the way our economic policies, just looking at the last few months, have rushed nearly limitless support to Wall Street and the largest corporations, while working class and middle class families and small businesses, it's been like pulling teeth to get help in so many cases. When we look at the urgent need, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation, Brionte, but since this is an environmentally themed conversation, I want to open up with a discussion. The urgent need for action to cut emissions and control pollution, and the power that polluting industries wield in Washington that distorts the incentives for our elected officials, so they wind up serving polluters instead of serving the public. It's a textbook example of how political corruption is undermining public health and undermining good public policy. And we also have a crisis in our political culture and our political system where increasingly elected officials and politicians are contemptuous of expertise, contemptuous of science, and therefore evidence is not driving public policy. And we're human beings. We're enlightened. We've got the scientific method. We've developed ways of understanding our world that can help us make informed policy decisions that benefit all of us. But we need elected officials who will make policy based on the evidence and in the interests of the public. It's not that complicated, but it's sorely needed. And I think right now we're seeing a great illustration of what happens when the system doesn't work.
Absolutely. So important, everything you just said, the way that you've opened this, it really puts in context what I think a lot of people who feel strongly about environment, who feel strongly about taking action on climate change feel. Even in the context of this crisis, many of us are very concerned about what's going on right now, but we know that it's very relevant and related to this ongoing climate struggle that we've been engaged in. And so I actually want to talk a little bit about that. Let's get into that, because that's what's on everyone's mind right now is coronavirus. It's the state opening back up. It's just a concern about of this topic. And so I think what's important is for us to connect the dots between climate change and coronavirus. And in order for us to do that, I want to just mention environmental justice, because I think the term will come up, and I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page when we say what environmental justice is. And I love the way that Mustafa Ali put it. He's the former head of the of environmental justice at the EPA. He said that it's the things that no one else wants. The things that no one else wants, they place them in communities of color, low-income communities and indigenous lands. They become the sacrifice zones for coal-fired power plants, for certified animal feeding operations, for waste treatment facilities, for unhealthy housing, where we find lead, and so many other impacts that are happening. In essence, the environmental justice injustices that continue to happen are happening to people of color and low-income communities. So that's what he said. And what's been interesting about that is that coronavirus has made these inequalities more obvious. Already, the data that we're getting back from several cities and states across the country show that it's the low-income and Black communities that are disproportionately experiencing fatality from corona. They're getting infected at higher rates as well. And a Harvard study came out and said, well, air pollution is a major factor. Places that have higher concentrations of air pollution are places that are experiencing higher incidences of coronavirus. And we know as environmentalists that air pollution impacts communities of color and low-income communities the most. In fact, Metro Atlanta is actually among the top 25 cities with the highest level of year-round particulate pollution, and communities like DeKalb, Fulton, and Gwinnett, and Henry County are all still receiving failing grades from the American Lung Association's State of the Air report. They're among the counties that are still trying to meet federal standards for ozone levels. So in other words, the air quality isn't so great in Georgia's metros, and it's especially not great in Black communities. And we've been talking about asthma rates and things like that with communities of color. So my question is whether you support legislation to strengthen compliance with Executive Order 12898. That's the President's Order on Environmental Justice. It was written in '94. And it mandates that each federal agency make achieving environmental justice a part of its mission. And they should do that by identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects of their programs and policies on low-income communities. So do you support legislation that strengthens that executive order on environmental justice?
I do, and this is a place where the parallels between the public health crisis that we're facing and the environmental crisis that we're facing are so clear, as you pointed out. And fundamentally, it's about power. And it's directly related to a lot of the points that we need to make about corruption in politics. Because the most basic principle of democracy should be that political power is shared equally by the people. One person, one vote, representation for everybody, so that policy decisions are made in the public interest. But where we have a political system where money buys access, money buys influence, and therefore money buys votes, we don't truly have democracy. And it's no surprise that people who lack wealth and power, and of course in America, that's not exclusively, but it's disproportionately people of color, don't have representation to stand up for them when, for example, environmental regulations are being made or enforced. So it's no surprise in a system that rewards wealth with power that the disempowered, who don't have access to their elected officials, who can't buy meetings with their senator, that's where contamination is dumped. That's where environmental protection regulations are not enforced. My opponent, Senator David Perdue, is one of those members of the US Senate who sells access for money explicitly. If you pay Senator Perdue's campaign $7,500 per year, then you are entitled to 4 annual meetings, access to his private home on the private island where he lives, and retreats on the private island where he lives. And so the folks who can pay that money to access and influence a US senator are the ones who will benefit from policy. And when environmental policy or public health policy is being made, those are the folks whose interests are represented. You're not going to find toxic chemicals dumped on Sea Island, where David Perdue lives, where you got to cross 2 gates and a bridge to get in. But if you go along the coast to the Savannah River Delta and Burke County, where there are high rates of cancer from contamination of the watershed and toxins in the environment, who do you find? You find poor Black folks who can never afford a meeting with their senator. And that is why when we think about, for example, that executive order, that the EPA should focus on poor and marginalized communities that suffer the most from environmental destruction, I fully support that, and we need to strengthen that. But we also have to recognize, in some ways, that's treating the symptom and not the underlying cause. The underlying cause is the disempowerment of people who lack wealth. And in order to address that, we have to reform our campaign finance system so that wealth doesn't buy power.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well put. I definitely think all of those things are really important. Environmental justice is a manifestation of these dynamics of wealth and access that you've talked about. And so while we're talking about coronavirus, I want to talk about, and actually, since we're talking about coronavirus, wealth, access, and environment, I want to talk about this idea of the recession that we might be headed into. There's predictions that say that we are headed into a recession, that it could be just as bad or worse than the financial crisis of 2008. And as we know, recessions affect the most vulnerable in our society: the sick, the elderly, people of color, low-income Americans. These, again, are the very same groups that we're talking about on the front lines of environmental pollution and climate change. And so as the crisis comes to a close and we turn our attention to rebuilding our communities after this, we know that there will be investment. There's already investment being made, trillions of dollars. But what could happen is that investment could go into improving our nation's electricity grids, energy pipelines, water systems, transportation, infrastructure, public buildings, all of which are in need of upgrades. And these kinds of high-level investments will help us rebuild the economy. It'll help us get to a 100% clean energy economy and potentially offer great, high-paying, family-sustaining jobs. So a lot of this is what was called for in the Green New Deal. And while I know we have had lots of discussion about the Green New Deal, one of my questions to you is, do you support an infrastructure agenda that is fair and equitable, that advances a clean energy economy, that prioritizes green, nature-based solutions, respects our environmental protections, and works to mitigate the changing climate?
No question. And by the way, there's actually strong bipartisan support among the people for historic investment in infrastructure. There's a real tangible economic return in the long term on investment in infrastructure. And we have neglected it for decades. And other countries around the world now have more advanced infrastructure than the United States, and that improves their economic competitiveness. That improves quality of life. It improves environmental outcomes and increases sustainability. And it improves public health. But we have not summoned the political will here in the United States, even though there's a ton of Democrats and Republicans and independents who all want an ambitious infrastructure bill. And it's vital that efforts to invest in our infrastructure massively invest in clean energy, in energy efficiency, in environmental protection and environmental remediation, where there's been massive damage already done to the planet. In terms of the economic impact, let's zoom in for a second, Brionte, if that's all right, on the economic impact of this pandemic, because it's so consistent with the themes we've already been discussing. When we have a sudden massive slowdown of economic activity and savings and incomes and jobs are disappearing and businesses are closing rapidly, your economic precariousness, how close you are to the edge of losing it all. That's how much runway you've got until you're in deep trouble when an economic crisis hits. And it would be rational for our economic policies to shore up the finances of the people in the most precarious situations first, so that all of these families, for example, who may be a few hundred or a few $1,000s away from being unable to afford necessities, from facing eviction or bankruptcy, get the fastest and most generous help. Because when working class and middle class people are suddenly in dire economic circumstances, the suffering is immense, the injustice is immense, and it does damage throughout the entire economy. Mm-hmm. But if we look at the response so far to this economic crisis, for investment banks and financial sector firms, for entities that make their money trading the stock market, for Wall Street, there's been literally trillions of dollars of emergency cash and emergency loans on very generous terms overnight. But ordinary people have had to wait weeks or over a month for a $1,200 check. A lot of small businesses, depending upon who they bank with, are finding it difficult to access the payroll protection program support. And it's not hard to answer why that is. It's the same thing we've been talking about this entire time. Because when money buys access and power, then the systems that policymakers create are going to serve folks who have money and power. And we're seeing that play out right now. And as you pointed out, what this crisis is doing is making things more stark that were already the case. Mm-hmm. But a crisis has a way of really clarifying who does have power. Just look at who gets help first and who gets the most generous help. And you'll find out who really has power and influence. Looking at the long term, we need to pass, and I will support in the US Senate, the most ambitious infrastructure bill in US history, with massive investment in clean energy that will create millions of job opportunities and job training opportunities, and it will lay the foundations for decades of prosperity and health and sustainability.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what you said is really important. These are ongoing impacts that have already been felt, that are being exacerbated by the way that we're responding to this. And there are a number of things that we could be doing differently. I want to talk a little bit about air pollution, right? So we talked about it and mentioned that places with the higher levels of air pollution are experiencing this. And so I'm sure you've heard of the ethylene oxide leaks happening in Smyrna, South Fulton, and Covington, Georgia, where these companies have been putting out high levels of known cancer-causing chemicals, and the releases have been allowed to continue with no clear reporting to the public. Further down south, we've got biomass power plants in Madison and Franklin County burning chemical-laced rail ties instead of fresh forest material that they said that they would use. People are complaining about the emissions, which in addition to the air quality are also killing fish through water runoff. And so this company has actually failed their particulate emissions tests, and they've been flagged for air and water violations. And these are just some of the most recent examples of air pollution in Georgia, all over the state that different people are experiencing. And I want to know, do you support protecting the funding necessary to enforce the laws and protect human health and the environment, and to take civil or criminal action against violators?
I do, and the way you asked that question is really perceptive and important, because you didn't just ask me, do I support those laws? You asked me if I support appropriating the funds necessary to enforce them. And we can have some of the most green, clean, pro-public health, environmental regulations in the world on the books. But if the EPA and the entities and the agents tasked with enforcing those laws don't have the resources to do so, or are simply ordered by the administration, which is riddled with lobbyists for polluters, not to enforce them, then those regulations are meaningless. Here's a really interesting thing that slipped under the radar, Brionte, and I know you didn't miss it, but amidst all this cacophony and news, a lot of folks did. What's one of the things that the Trump administration did very swiftly when this crisis broke? They said they were going to stop enforcing routine air and water pollution regulations. So here we've got a public health crisis, an economic crisis that's been made so much worse because our elected officials had contempt for science, didn't pay attention to data and evidence, didn't listen to experts who were warning us of the need to prepare. Mm-hmm. And the public policy response is to allow more pollution of our environment in the face of all of the warnings from experts and all of the evidence that pollution is out of control and damaging human health. Again, we have to ask ourselves why, when it doesn't make any sense. And by the way, no one supports it. If we went out on the street and we asked anybody, Democrat, Republican, independent, apathetic, if they believe that the proper way to respond to a pandemic is to let polluters dump into air and water, no one's for that. Mm-hmm. So if no one's for it and it's a bad idea, why does it happen? And the answer again is corruption. The answer is that policymakers are dancing to the tune of powerful polluting industries who throw money around Washington like it's nothing. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump ran for president on a promise to drain the swamp. A huge number of his cabinet officials and their deputies are lobbyists. The EPA, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Brionte, is run by a former lobbyist for the coal industry. The Defense Department is run by a former lobbyist for defense contractors. I mean, this is, to me, this should transcend partisan politics. We can't have folks who made their living trying to influence public policy on behalf of major industries, then responsible for looking out for the public interest and the regulation of those industries.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because this is where we are right now. No enforcement, no protections on things that really matter for our public health in the middle of a public health crisis. It's alarming and it is very frustrating. And so we can keep talking about these challenges, but I do like to talk about solutions. I think as environmentalists, we can sometimes spin in all of the things that need to be fixed. So let's keep on this topic of air pollution and talk about some of the things we're going to need to reduce air emissions. So I think what's pretty interesting is what's been coming out about air quality right now. Cities around the globe are recording plummeting pollution levels, and the same can be said for Georgia cities. And that is because we've limited air travel, there are fewer cars on the road, and we've reduced energy consumption, all things that have helped dramatically reduce levels of pollution. And so these are all things environmentalists have been asking for. And let's start with transportation. Transportation policy has far-reaching impacts. It will help us reduce oil consumption when we make smarter choices about transportation. We can mitigate climate change. It's good for national security, good use of public land, and public health and quality of life is improved when you have transit. So we also know that the transportation sector is the largest source of carbon pollution in the United States. And that pollution isn't just limited to metro areas. One of the things that we thought we had made progress on was securing some clean car standards. In 2012, the Obama administration passed some standards for automakers and unions and environmental groups. They all came together and agreed on those standards that were set through 2025. And despite the fact that these standards have been successful in curbing emissions from new cars, President Trump and the EPA have rolled back those protections and have put a new rule in place that is just not sufficient. So do you support strong clean car standards and protecting states' authority under the Clean Air Act to adopt stricter state level standards?
I do, and it's about efficiency, Brionte. I mean, what we're seeing right now is not how we want to reduce pollution. We don't want to reduce pollution by reducing economic activity. We want to reduce pollution by ensuring that economic activity doesn't destroy the environment.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to choose between productivity and commerce and wealth or health and sustainability. We can have both of those things. It's a tall tale told to us by polluters that we have to make a choice there. And the reason that that fallacy persists is because those polluters don't want to have to make the tough choices to transition to more efficient means of travel, more efficient means of production. So we want to keep growing this economy. We want to keep creating more opportunity and more commerce and more wealth and more jobs. And we want to do it in a way that is consistent with principles of sustainability. And so that is why I will not just push to roll back the Trump administration's cuts to these emission standards and to air and water quality standards. I will work to strengthen those efficiency standards. And then our infrastructure and energy policy should make it in the economic interest of innovators and producers and companies to produce more efficient technology. We have within ourselves as human beings, with our drive and ingenuity and brilliance, to thrive and to have a sustainable and healthy society. We should never let anyone tell us that achieving sustainability and efficiency and generating clean energy and being in good health means that we have to choose poverty or cease trading with one another or stop visiting our families or traveling the world. What we need to do is invest in the technology and pass common sense efficiency standards so that we can do those things sustainably without destroying our environment and without destroying our health.
All right. And so let's move into energy. We've got to clean up our energy sector. We need clean energy. And I want to talk about 100% clean energy because this is the conversation that's being had at city council levels, county commissions, and at state levels. Other states, of course, Georgia hasn't quite gotten there yet, but hopefully we will. 100% clean energy economy is necessary to avert the worst impacts of climate change while creating good jobs, boosting our economy, saving money for consumers, and protecting our health. And what we've seen with clean energy is that it has grown rapidly as the cost of the technology has plummeted, and solar now employs more people in the US electricity generation sector than oil, gas, coal combined. We must increase our use of and investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and geothermal. So do you support transitioning to 100% clean energy no later than 2050 to help build pollution-free communities?
Well, I think what we need to do is get to 100% non-carbon emitting energy generation sooner than that. I mean, we should be, I think, precise and driven by evidence and data. And what's clear in the environmental science, meteorology, climatology, is that it is emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are driving climate change. And if we don't reduce the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as has been predicted for decades, then we risk the most dire consequences of climate change with enormous impacts on human health and security and prosperity. So getting to 100% non-carbon emitting energy production can't wait until 2050. The science is clear on that. And the reason that I'm being very precise about carbon emissions is because when we're talking about climate change, I think we need to be really clear about exactly the form of pollution that is driving it. Look, I'm all for making our economy as clean as it can be. And we have far too much pollution and contamination and dumping of all kinds. But where the scientific community has an overwhelming consensus, and it's not just people in academia, it's the military, it's the intelligence community, that if we don't control carbon emissions, we're going to face extreme economic and public health consequences. We need to be laser focused on carbon emissions as the target of the most aggressive cuts. So that's why I believe, and for example, and what I'm about to say is not an opinion. I don't know if you share it, Brionte, it's not held by all in the environmental community, and I recognize that. When I look at the energy production needs of our economy and our society, and the vital importance of reducing carbon emissions, I personally believe that nuclear energy needs to be a part of that energy mix. I know that that's controversial among some environmentalists, and there's all kinds of problems with nuclear energy. And there's all kinds of steps we need to take to make it safer and to reduce contamination and risk of meltdown. But I try to be realistic and driven by a realistic understanding of our energy needs and what the most significant threats to our environment are. And if we're going to get to zero carbon emissions from energy production sooner than 2050, then it's likely that nuclear power has to be a part of that mix.
Well, so you bring up a couple of things, and I've got two questions in response to that. But I'll start with nuclear, and then I'm going to come back to this point about carbon emissions. Yeah, that's a very controversial thing. I think it's something that I've been talking about. It depends on the environmentalist whether they support it or not. It is a significant part of our energy generation, especially here in Georgia. And Plant Vogtle is obviously the nuclear plant on everyone's mind because so many of us are paying for it. And so you said that you believe it should be a part of the energy mix. What do you think about the way that it's been funded, ratepayers being charged? Do you support ratepayers picking up the cost to build these plants?
No, and that's the exact, you are always very perceptive, Brionte, and that's the exact point that needs to be made about nuclear power, and particularly here in Georgia. Here in Georgia, the utility company budgeted the project for the construction of new nuclear reactors at Plant Vogtle. And they are vastly over budget and behind schedule. And so because they want to protect their shareholders above all, they have lobbied our Public Service Commission to pass those cost overruns onto the people through the rates we pay for energy production. And that's wrong, and that is corruption. And by the way, we had a Public Service Commission race here in Georgia in 2018, as you know well, but I'm trying to give everyone the context here who's tuned in.
They'll be on the ballot again this year in 20.
And there was a candidate named Lindy Miller who opposed passing the costs of the utility company's failures onto ratepayers. And there was another candidate who wanted to do exactly what the utility wanted. And what happened down the stretch of that race? The utility dumped more than $1 million of dark money into television advertising, attacking Lindy Miller, and she was narrowly defeated. So again, we come full circle to the issue of political corruption and the way that the most powerful trade groups are able to use their financial power to distort public policy contrary to the public interest and in the interest of their shareholders exclusively.
So the question I have as a follow-up to that is one of the few things we have to try to enforce the things that need to be done. So the regulations that we're passing to try to limit emissions, particularly carbon emissions, they need to be enforced by entities like the EPA. And so the question I have is, do you oppose all efforts to undermine the Clean Air Act, including preserving the EPA's authority to cut carbon and other pollution fueling climate change?
I absolutely oppose these attacks on the Clean Air Act, and I want to see the Clean Air Act strengthened, and I'll introduce legislation and support legislation to do that in the United States Senate. And the job of a US Senator is not simply to offer and vote on legislation. It's also to conduct rigorous oversight of the executive branch of the US government. It's the role of Congress to ensure that, for example, the EPA is enforcing environmental regulations consistent with the law and the public interest, without abuse, without undue influence of the industry they're meant to be regulating, without corruption, without fraud. And we see Congress fallen down on the job, frankly, in both political parties and no matter who controls the White House. I mean, this is a little bit of a segue, but I want to make clear to anyone who's watching here that I'm not running for US Senate to be a partisan soldier. I'm not running for US Senate for the glory of any political party. And when Joe Biden is in the White House, I'll hold his feet to the fire too. If his administration does not enforce the laws on the books as it should, then I will bring the same judicious and focused oversight to that administration as I would to the Trump administration. We got to get out of this place we're in right now where congressional oversight is just a partisan weapon. You will never hear my opponent, Senator David Perdue, utter one word of criticism of Donald Trump because they're in the same political party. And you won't see David Perdue take any action to meaningfully oversee, for example, how these trillions of dollars of bailout funds are being used, or how the EPA is enforcing the law right now because the administration's from his own political party. So to return to your question, I support rigorous enforcement of the Clean Air Act. I support strengthening of the Clean Air Act. And I'm gonna keep complimenting you, Brionte, because as always, you deserve it. You made a very important point about whether carbon emissions should be treated as pollution. That's one of the most important questions in environmental policy right now. And the answer is yes, carbon emissions are pollution, just like anything else that stacks or vehicles or combustion engines release into the atmosphere that damage our environment. And one of the trickiest things that industry has done has been to try to get carbon emissions removed as a form of pollution, thus preventing the EPA from enforcing restrictions on carbon emissions. Unless we understand that greenhouse gas emissions are a form of air pollution, we're not going to be able to control those emissions and therefore mitigate climate change and reduce climate change.
Yeah, I agree.
You don't mind all the compliments, do you? For folks who are just tuning in, need to understand that Brionte and I have known each other for a little while. So
quite some time at this point. So I appreciate you for joining me here. I think that we should open it up to questions. I wanted to talk about one thing though, so let's try to make this answer quick. It's about another form of pollution, and it's called, well, the abbreviation is PFAS or PFAS is what people are calling them. These are forever chemicals. They're toxic, they're persistent, and they're widely used man-made chemicals that pose a serious threat to our health. Right here in Georgia, the United States Air Force, we've got military bases throughout Georgia, but they have been using these chemicals, PFAS, that have contaminated water near bases and exposed communities to these chemicals that are linked to cancer and other health problems. Even at low levels, they're problematic. And we've got a map of all of the different sites that these chemicals have been found in Georgia. So this gets back to the EPA. The Trump administration right now is trying to rewrite the rules around this chemical. Do you support legislation that would establish strong health-based standards for regulating PFAS and protecting, and those standards would protect the most vulnerable populations and hold the polluters accountable for cleaning up the damage that they have caused?
I do, and these chemicals are often used as fire retardants. And they can be carcinogenic. The impacts on human health are significant and not entirely understood. And it's been so distressing to see all of the opposition to controlling them. I mean, this is human health that we're talking about. And while we're talking about forever chemicals, I also support a rapidly phased in ban on single-use plastics. We are choking our planet with plastic waste. It's one of the most significant threats to our health out there. Yeah. It's literally snowing plastic in the Arctic. And we were talking about how PFAS chemicals contaminate our bodies. Here's an interesting fact about plastic waste. Because it's so ubiquitous, because it's everywhere, and because it breaks down into microplastics that work their way up the food chain and into all biomass, we can't actually test what the health impact of plastic waste is because there's no control group. In other words, we can't find humans who don't have it. And so we're unable to assess what the health impacts are. There are whole areas of the oceans just covered in plastic waste. A lot of this stuff we export to poorer countries. We want to talk about environmental justice. We got to talk about environmental justice in a global context, not just within the US. We need to end the days that wealthier countries think it's acceptable to export waste and pollution and contamination and plastic to poorer countries. There is a crisis globally of plastic all over this planet. And I again come back to my conviction that there's much more common ground on this among the people than we might think from watching the politicians. Everyone recognizes this is a problem. No one wants to go see plastic bags clogging up all our creeks and waterways. No one wants microplastics riddling our bodies and becoming part of every living thing. It's just common sense. And we need more elected officials, in my opinion, who will just look at public health data, look at what's really going on in the world, and instead of catering to donors who pay them money for access, pass public policy competently that serves our clear public interest. It's not that complicated what we need to do. The complicated part is that our system's so broken, it's hard to do it.
I hear you. Some of these things are very well researched. Some of the things we've been asking for as environmentalists have a lot of science behind them, saying that this is the right thing to do, giving a pathway for doing it. But it's really about will. It's really about our elected officials being brave enough to champion these policies, to pass them and to fund them. So I have a couple of questions from the Facebook live chat. And for the folks who are on Zoom, if you wanted to go ahead and type your questions into the chat, please do that. I will unmute everyone after I get this question out, in case you don't know how to do the chat on Zoom, and that's okay. But the first question I have from the Facebook chat is actually with regard to transportation. So we talked about clean air and clean car standards. And the question I have is, can we also have fewer cars? In other words, we need to reform the Federal Highway Administration. The feds incentivize states to spend huge sums of money to expand highways. So do you have thoughts on fewer cars on the road and funding for alternative transit?
Well, when I say I support the most ambitious infrastructure bill in US history, that has to include huge investment in transit. Transit is not just an environmental issue. It's a critical economic issue. It's an economic justice issue. Here in Atlanta, for example, where we've got all of this rapid economic development in the urban core, and increasingly folks having trouble affording housing and getting pushed out of communities where they've lived for decades because the property taxes or the rent are too high, and having to move very long distances from places of work. First of all, an infrastructure bill needs to deal with housing and affordable housing, but we could have a whole separate conversation about that. Atlanta doesn't have the transit infrastructure that we need to let people get around the metro area efficiently and affordably and safely, and in a way that doesn't clog our highways and streets with traffic and clog our air with smog and generate greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. And it's another area where most people agree. It's a common sense quality of life enhancer for working people and for all people, that we want to be able to get around the places that we live and get between home and work and play and green space and the healthcare we need and our kids' schools safely and affordably. And the United States is so far behind on public transit. And you mentioned the highway system. We're also so far behind on transportation between metropolitan areas that doesn't rely on the automobile.
Mhm.
And we have these rights of way where the interstate highways are.
Yep.
And what I would like to see is much more aggressive action to look at those as possible rail corridors. For example, there's a lot of study going into how we can connect Atlanta and Charlotte, and looking at whether or not the I-85 corridor presents a right of way where we could build a higher speed rail line so that folks can get between Charlotte and Atlanta swiftly and without having to sit in a car, and they can do work on the way, and it can be cheaper and it can be more sustainable. And it's also good for commerce. It links areas of economic activity. It allows people to trade and do business. And it's just common sense. And it's an area where we're well behind other countries. A lot of the times when folks talk about, for example, high-speed rail, we think about only the most expensive possible solutions, and cutting entirely new rights of way and grading them so that trains can go at extremely high speeds. That is really, really expensive. But we can use a lot of our existing highway infrastructure to build efficient and convenient and rapid transportation between metro areas. And it's only the federal government that has the resources to do that.
So, okay, so interesting. And so I could talk about transit all day, but I got other questions. So a growing concept in conservation is the 30 by 30 initiative to conserve 30% of our land by 2030, whether by easement or other means. And this is especially in the face of growing populations and worsening urban sprawl. What would you do to advance land protections on a federal level?
Well, we're seeing right now the Trump administration in blatant service to their political donors, invading protected and public lands and opening it up to environmentally destructive economic exploitation. Look, there are good uses of land that are productive and that are necessary for our economy, and we're not going to turn the whole country into a park, but it's vital that we conserve and grow protected wildlands, wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, because the encroachment of polluting industry and all of the things that destroy habitats and ecosystems and threaten endangered species, we have to strike the right balance. And it's really depressing to see these beautiful public parks that are a gem, that are part of our national heritage, that are part of what make our country great, that inspire so many people and provide so many people with access to nature, to see them shrinking and destroyed. So I will support increasing protected wilderness areas and wildlife refuges and national parks.
All right. I got a question from Mark. How do we restore respect for science? Can we bring science back into the decision-making process without taking back the Senate?
I'll answer it this way. Actually, taking back the Senate is not sufficient in and of itself to put science and evidence and data in the place that they belong in public policymaking, in our national life, and in our government. And when you think about how systematically science has been discredited, I mean, one of the things that I always think about, Brionte, is the efforts to regulate the tobacco industry as just a great case of corruption and the use of special interest money to discredit science. Those tobacco executives went up to Capitol Hill and they sat down before congressional committees under oath, and they solemnly swore that there was no link between smoking and cancer. They perjured themselves to protect their shareholders. And in so doing, they literally sentenced hundreds of thousands or millions of people to death and emphysema and lung cancer. We're seeing the same thing in environmental science and in the discussion about climate change, because there has been now for decades a systematic and very well-funded effort to discredit a clear scientific consensus on the impact of emissions on our environment. And that effort is motivated exclusively by the desire of those polluting industries to maximize the short-term returns to their shareholders, no matter the long-term cost. One of the things that we have to do is we have to make sure that the long-term costs of pollution are borne by polluters and not the public. And environmental science is one of the ways we assess those costs. But zooming out a little bit back into the discussion about science, I think it's one of the most dangerous dynamics in the world today is this war on science. Because peer-reviewed science is not flawless. It's not infallible. It's also clearly the best means human beings have devised to understand what's happening in the world and to our health and to our environment. And we should cherish that and elevate it and not treat it like it's some kind of conspiracy against commerce or some kind of political tool.
Yeah, that's really, really well put. Really well put. If we can't trust science, then what can we trust?
And look, skepticism is always good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, good science incorporates skepticism, and good science is challenged and involves experts weighing different theories and having a real discussion. But these long-term, well-funded propaganda campaigns to discredit science entirely, that's the path to ruin.
I hear that. I got one more question for you, and it's simple. And Elvis, if you could give me a thumbs up and let me know if I get it right. How can you help?
I saw Elvis in his Jon Ossoff swag. I
Yeah.
appreciate you, Elvis.
So how can you keep the streets clean? So I'm guessing this is a question about maybe litter, recycling, trash. Okay, perfect. Yep. How can you help keep the streets clean?
Well, we need to have a kind of reckoning and a moment of being real with ourselves about what's happening with recycling. Because all across the country, recycling programs are getting shut down. And I was talking earlier about how we export so much of our waste to poorer countries. And that's been the story of a lot of recycling for a long time. That a lot of that plastic waste that, a lot of people probably imagined was going to facilities in America where it was broken down and repurposed, was in fact being packed onto massive ships. This is really inefficient, by the way. Think about this, shipping tons and tons of plastic waste, thousands and thousands of miles. We talk about unnecessary emissions, right? But, and it was winding up in China, for example, where some of those facilities existed, but increasingly countries don't want to accept our trash, and you can't really blame them. Who wants to be a dumping ground? So we need to have a real, I don't have all the solutions on recycling, but we need to have a real national conversation. And I'll commit right now that when I'm in the US Senate, I will lead that discussion and make sure that we understand precisely how the recycling economy really works and what we need to do to restore it. We also can't use recycling as an excuse for extravagant waste. So when I talk about needing to phase in a ban on single-use plastics, that reflects my belief that we've used recycling as an excuse. Like, it's okay that our habits of consumption generate tons and tons of polluting waste because we believe in some way that we can't really understand that it's being reused, when really it's just winding up in a landfill on the other side of the planet. So the answer, I think, is efficiency. We have to reduce the amount of waste and single-use materials and contamination from economic activity. And I just want to put a pin in this by coming back to something that we talked about at the very beginning of the conversation. None of this means that we have to become less prosperous. None of this means that we have to reduce our quality of life. This is improving our quality of life. It's not in our economic interest or any other interest to be generating all this plastic waste every day. It's foolish and unnecessary. And we can be wealthy and we can have a thriving economy, and we can have full employment and all the things we want and build generational wealth and increase opportunity over time and still be healthy and clean.
Mm-hmm.
It takes following science, it takes investments in technology, and it takes policymaking based on evidence, not serving political donors.
Absolutely. I think that that's all a really great way to conclude this conversation. All of the things that you've talked about are such critical topics when it comes to environment. It's a big subject. It's going to be a big lift for us to clean up the environmental pollution and to really build an economy that is positioned to mitigate climate change and to be resilient in the face of a changing climate. And so I want to thank you for your time here. For all the folks I said I was going to unmute, I had a lot of questions come in the chat, so sorry about that. But I'm sure you'll catch Jon, plenty of events and on the campaign trail the rest of the year. So thank you for joining us. We will make this video available for viewing. I'll make sure that everyone who joined the call gets the link as soon as it's ready. We'll be up on our website. Please share it far and wide. It's important that people know where their candidates stand on environment. And this was a fabulous conversation, Jon. Thank you so much.
Hey, Brionte.
Yeah.
I want to thank you and I want to commend you for your work as the executive director of Georgia Conservation Voters. And normally this is where a politician would plug their own website and how to volunteer for their campaign, but I want to take it a little bit differently. And I want to encourage everyone who's on this live stream to go to the Georgia Conservation Voters website and contribute 30, 50, $100 right now so that Brionte and her amazing team can keep advocating for sustainability and for health here in Georgia and across the country. I appreciate and love and respect you. Thank you for having me, and let's stay in touch. I hope that you and your family are well, and wish you the best of health.
Much love, Jon. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and well.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you.